I didn't cry, not when I saw the text. Not even when I walked into that quiet conference room and saw the folder with my name already printed on the tab. It was a Friday afternoon and the sky over Portland looked exactly like I felt: gray, overcast, and tired. The message had come from Ben Callahan, the new regional operations head. 4 words, no greeting. Need to see you, no subject, no warning. Just a chill I couldn't quite explain. My name is Dana Whitaker. I'm 52 years old. And up until that moment, I had worked at Valley Fresh for 17 years, steadily, loyally, almost invisibly. I'd climbed every rung of the ladder the old-fashioned way, through overtime shifts, late-night inventory audits, and weekends sacrificed for store openings. I'd trained dozens of associates, introduced an inventory system that saved the chain 6 figures, and kept our Oregon flagship location among the top 3 in the region year after year. But none of that mattered, apparently, not to Ben. He sat across from me like a man who had already moved on. "Your role has been reviewed," he said, not quite looking at me. "It's no longer aligned with the company's forward strategy." That's how it ends sometimes, not with fireworks, not with confrontation, just 4 minutes and a handshake. But this isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about silence and about timing. Because what Ben didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I already had a signed offer letter in my bag, one that would make me his new boss in 72 hours. So, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly replaced in a role you gave your heart to, stay with me. This is a story about how to rise not louder, but higher. Because success doesn't always slam the door on the way out. Sometimes it holds it open on the way back in. No. The message came at 3:17 p.m. on a Friday, just when the store was beginning to settle into that slow pre-weekend lull. I had just returned from the stockroom, double-checking our seasonal displays for a last-minute audit. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Need to see you, conf room 4. That was it. No context, no punctuation, no subject line. Just the kind of clipped urgency that makes your stomach flip without knowing why. I stared at it for a moment longer than I probably should have. After 17 years with Valley Fresh, I'd received my fair share of meeting requests, inventory reviews, hiring proposals, training evaluations. But this felt off. Ben Callahan, our new regional operations head, wasn't known for friendliness or follow-ups. At 34, he was the kind of corporate transplant who believed that change was best achieved by removing anything that looked like it had roots. He barely knew my name yet, now he needed to see me. I took the long hallway toward conference room 4, my flats squeaking slightly against the waxed floors. On the way, I passed Justin from bakery restocking bagels with the same quiet precision he always had. He nodded at me. I smiled back, wondering if it would be the last time I'd make that walk as someone who belonged here. When I reached the door, I paused. It was closed, a small detail, but one that said everything. At Valley Fresh, we prided ourselves on open-door culture, transparency, collaboration. But the door was closed, and behind it, Ben was waiting. This was the same man who in his first week had ended 2 long-standing department head contracts without even so much as a farewell note. Streamlining, he called it, modernizing our workflow. The rest of us called it something else entirely. I knew Catherine in customer service still cried in her car some mornings before coming in. And Thomas, who'd worked warehouse logistics for 22 years, had taken early retirement because the writing was on the wall. I knocked gently, then pushed the door open. Ben stood by the window, arms crossed. Patricia from HR sat at the table, a neutral smile already painted on. And in front of her, that folder, my name on the tab. Even before they said a word, I knew. It's strange, the clarity that comes in moments like that. Not panic, not outrage, just a soft click, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. The text, the closed door, Patricia's presence. It wasn't personal. It was strategic, a chess move dressed as a performance review. But here's the thing, people who work in operations long enough know how systems behave. You don't just see people, you see patterns. And I'd seen this one before. It always started with vague emails, then silence from higher-ups, then a sudden invitation to a room with no coffee and too much air conditioning. This wasn't about my performance. It was about my salary, my experience, my voice in meetings that sometimes pushed back on flashy changes and shallow metrics. I sat down. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When Patricia slid the folder across, I signed it without reading. Not because I gave up, but because I already knew something they didn't. That's the lesson I want to start with. Sometimes your silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. Because while they were preparing to let me go, someone else, someone higher, was already preparing a seat for me. And that seat wasn't in conference room 4. It was in San Francisco. Now let me tell you what happened 2 weeks earlier. The room was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was the vents or maybe just the tone. Patricia from HR had that practiced expression that said she'd done this more times than she could count. Calm professional, faintly apologetic. Like she'd been told to look sympathetic but not too involved. Ben didn't sit down. He stayed by the window staring at the parking lot like something out there mattered more than this conversation. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. Old habit. It kept them from shaking. He finally turned, took a breath, and said it like he was reading from a slide deck. After reviewing our operational priorities, we've decided your role is no longer aligned with the company's future direction. No greeting, no acknowledgement of my 17 years. No thanks, just a corporate execution wrapped in tidy vocabulary. Patricia pushed the folder toward me. This outlines your severance package exit instructions and final paycheck schedule. Your access to company email has already been deactivated, and your ID badge will be collected today. I wanted to laugh not because it was funny, but because it was so rehearsed, so perfectly impersonal. The kind of thing you might find in a manual under how to fire long-term employees without creating legal risk. I glanced down at the folder, then back up at them. Patricia avoided my eyes. Ben tapped his fingers against his sleeve, clearly bracing for an outburst. But I didn't give him one. Instead, I smiled. A soft, measured smile that said more than words ever could. I slid the folder back toward me unsigned. Thank you for the clarity, I said. And the experience. I smoothed the hem of my cardigan and walked out. I could feel the air shift behind me. Ben's relief was almost audible. He had expected drama, maybe even tears. But what he got was silence, and that silence I knew would haunt him more. Because dignity unsettles the people who expect collapse. Here's the truth, they never say out loud when corporations talk about aligning resources or shifting strategy. What they often mean is this: you've become too valuable to ignore and too expensive to keep. It's not that you failed, it's that your consistency made others look inconsistent. Your steadiness made their shortcuts obvious. I'd seen it happen before, quietly, methodically. A few years back, a woman named Laura, who managed our Southern division, was pushed out the same way. Her numbers were solid, her team adored her, but she was too outspoken in regional calls, too grounded in reality for the new leadership's branding spin. She was gone within a quarter. This wasn't personal, but it was patterned. And patterns are data. I packed up my things slowly, not because I was stalling, but because I was remembering. The first day I started here, I was 35, recently divorced, and terrified I wouldn't be able to support my daughter alone. I remembered the first holiday rush when I stayed overnight to help the team restock shelves. The time we had a power outage and I hand-labeled prices for an entire shift. Every corner of the store held a piece of my story. And now it was over, or so they thought. Because what neither Ben nor Patricia knew was that 2 weeks earlier I had stepped into a different kind of conference room, one with a view of the bay and a seat across from two people who didn't see me as a cost center. They saw me as a solution. And they had made me an offer. Let me take you back to that day. The day this whole thing began to change. The day I realized losing a job doesn't always mean losing your power. 2 weeks before I walked into that cold, boxed room, I found myself in a very different space. A high-rise building in downtown San Francisco surrounded by glass walls and gentle echoes. I had taken the day off, discreetly claiming a family matter, and drove the 3 hours in quiet anticipation. I didn't even tell Gabriella, my daughter. Not yet. The invitation came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Cynthia Lau, now Vice President of Regional Strategy at Valley Fresh. She'd been a colleague early in my career and had apparently been following my work from afar. We'd like to discuss your future with us, the email had said. It was simple, respectful, and above all, curious. That's what struck me. Someone was curious about what I could still offer. I arrived at the 18th floor, greeted by a view of the bay and two unfamiliar but warm faces, Cynthia and Jerome Klein, the new chief of operations. They didn't open with small talk. We've been reviewing long-term metrics across the region, Cynthia said. And your store 122 has consistently outperformed peers across all KPIs. Jerome added, we think it's time you stop managing one store and start guiding many. I listened, almost stunned, as they laid out their vision. A new leadership model, a position that would oversee 12 locations across Northern California. Not just manage, but mentor. Restructure with heart. We don't just need results, Jerome said, we need wisdom, and your leadership style reflects both. I didn't say yes right away. I asked questions, about autonomy, about resources, about whether this was just a token move to patch up PR. But the more they shared, the more I saw the difference. They weren't offering me a title, they were offering me a voice. When they slid the folder across the table, sleek black embossed with the company seal, I didn't open it immediately. I already knew what was inside: a salary twice what I was making, a corporate apartment, a support team, travel stipends, respect. I left that meeting lighter, not just because of what I'd been offered, but because someone had finally seen the full scope of what I'd built quietly, steadily for years. That's why back in that windowless conference room with Ben and Patricia, I didn't flinch. Because while they thought they were closing my story, they were actually clearing the path for the next chapter. Here's the thing: when you've done the work, really done it, you don't need to open every folder. You already know what you've earned. And now it was time to plan the transition. Not out of Valley Fresh, but into a role where people like Ben would answer to people like me. Let me show you what happened next. How I returned to the store not with a box, but with a badge and a title that changed everything. After I walked out of conference room 4 that Friday, I didn't slam any doors. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even stop by the break room to say goodbye. I just gathered the few personal items I kept in my desk: a ceramic mug Gabriella made in middle school, a framed photo of our store's holiday team in 2017, and a small planner that still had sticky notes from last week's vendor calls. I let Ben have his moment, let him believe he'd cleaned house, that he'd eliminated another cost inefficiency. He probably expected me to rant on social media or rally the team behind closed doors. But what he didn't know was that the real conversation had already moved far beyond the four walls of that store. That weekend, I didn't mourn, I planned. I met with Cynthia and Jerome again over brunch at a quiet cafe in the Marina District. We went over the onboarding timeline. I requested 2 weeks before starting, just enough to tie loose ends, but not enough for gossip to run wild. They agreed. The appointment remains confidential until next Friday's corporate-wide announcement, Cynthia said. That gave me 5 full working days to observe, to finish what I had started, and to prepare for what came next. So on Monday morning, I showed up at store 122 as usual. I greeted team leads, checked in on the produce shipment, even helped the bakery team troubleshoot a faulty timer. I smiled through it all because this wasn't pretending, this was preparing. Every task I touched, every interaction I had was part of something bigger now. That week, Ben was preparing his quarterly board presentation. He looked surprised to see me in the building, but he didn't question it. Not out loud. I offered to help polish his numbers, streamline a few charts, proof the slides. He accepted because even when he underestimated me, he still trusted my work. Meanwhile, I noticed changes in his behavior. Twice I caught him scanning old vendor emails I'd sent. Once he asked one of our younger managers if I'd ever overridden an expense report. I wasn't surprised. Ben didn't build trust, he built cases. And I was the last holdover from a version of Valley Fresh he didn't understand. Here's what I learned in those quiet days between roles. You don't have to fight for a seat at the table when you're about to be handed the head chair. Let others play their scene, righteous, dramatic, or short-sighted. It's not your cue yet. Your scene will come. But it has to be written with grace. Because power isn't in the moment you rise. It's in the way you wait. And I was waiting for Friday, the day the curtain would rise. Friday arrived with the kind of stillness that only comes before something big. I woke up before my alarm, made my coffee a little slower, and stared out the window longer than usual. That day marked 17 years since I first stepped into Valley Fresh. But this morning wasn't about memory. It was about momentum. At exactly noon, the corporate announcement email went out, subject line, Leadership Update, Northern California Region. Attached was a sleek, polished PDF with my photo in the corner and a headline that read, Dana Whitaker, appointed Regional Director for Northern California, effective Monday. Below that was a summary of my contributions, a quote from Jerome about values-driven leadership, and a list of locations under my new supervision, including store 122. By 12:06, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Is this real? One text read from Maria in front end. No way, said another, followed by a string of celebratory emojis. A third simply said, he's not taking it well. I didn't need to ask who he was. Julia from HR called shortly after. Ben locked himself in the upstairs office, she whispered. He thought there was a mistake in the announcement. He called corporate, twice. It wasn't just that I was back. It was that I'd never really left. And now every decision he'd made, every role he'd cut, every name he'd erased was about to be reviewed by the person who'd quietly built the systems he tried to dismantle. Word spread quickly through the store. I heard that the lunchroom went silent when the email popped up on everyone's terminals. Some clapped, some stared. One of the newer cashiers reportedly said, Wait, she's the new what? Even the store's atmosphere shifted. The weight in the air wasn't fear, it was a mix of justice and curiosity. I stayed quiet, replied with only brief thank yous. No details, no boasting. Because while the office was freezing in its tracks, I was still moving forward. That's the lesson. When others pause in panic, keep walking with purpose. Because the next step was walking back through those doors. Not as the former manager, but as the new boss, and Monday was coming fast. Monday morning arrived draped in a quiet San Francisco fog, the kind that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath. I dressed slowly, carefully, burgundy blazer, cream blouse, black tailored pants, heels not too high, but just enough to click with quiet purpose. It had been years since I'd worn anything other than my work flats and a Valley Fresh polo, but today wasn't about comfort, it was about presence. I'd never thought much about the walk from the parking lot to the front doors of Store 122. It used to be routine, almost invisible, but that morning every step felt different. Not because the distance changed, but because I had. I didn't walk like someone returning to the scene of her dismissal. I walked like someone stepping into a place that was about to shift. Inside, I caught them watching, not out of disrespect, but curiosity. Familiar faces paused what they were doing. Haley from produce froze mid-display. Marcus from receiving nodded slowly. I returned each look with calm, not triumph. Because this wasn't a victory lap. This was a new beginning. Ms. Whitaker, Haley said, catching up as I approached the doors. You look powerful, I smiled. Thank you. You all helped build that. When I reached the hallway, I passed the break room. Patricia from HR was there, standing stiffly with a cup of coffee, clearly rehearsing a welcome she wasn't expecting to deliver. She gave a half nod. I gave a full one back. Then I walked to the conference room, my heels steady against the polished floor. I paused at the door just long enough to take a breath. Through the glass, I could see Ben. He was pacing. The same man who had dismissed me less than 2 weeks ago. Only now he was preparing to greet his new direct supervisor. That's the lesson no one teaches you in leadership books. How you walk in matters. Not the shoes, not the outfit, but the clarity in your step, the integrity behind your silence, the purpose behind your pause. And I was ready. Because behind that door wasn't just a meeting. It was the start of everything I had been quietly preparing for. When I opened the door, Ben looked up and froze. He had that expression people get when their brain is working overtime to catch up with reality. His mouth parted slightly, not in greeting, but in disbelief. I stepped in with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. Good morning, Ben, I said, setting my leather folder on the table. Shall we begin? He blinked, trying to collect himself. Ms. Whitaker. Regional Director Whitaker, I corrected gently, with a tone that invited professionalism, not revenge. Let's start with the quarterly performance overview. He fumbled with his laptop, pulling up the slides he had clearly rehearsed all weekend. Charts, metrics, summaries, some accurate, some conveniently skewed. He walked me through improved turnover figures, modest sales lifts, and a new training initiative he claimed had boosted efficiency. What he didn't mention was that most of those systems were built before he arrived under my leadership. And what he didn't realize was that I had copies of those original proposals in my folder, time-stamped and approved long before his tenure. When he finished, I offered a polite nod. Thank you. Now I'd like to review the termination of a long-standing senior operations lead, executed without regional consultation or documentation. That employee had 17 years with the company. Her exit was processed in under 5 minutes. His jaw clenched, and now I continued sliding a report across the table. We're seeing a 26% increase in turnover since that decision, along with a 14-point drop in customer satisfaction and a spike in inventory loss. How do you explain that? Ben looked to the door, maybe for help, maybe just for escape. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't shame him, I simply let the numbers speak. Because in leadership, data isn't just information, it's accountability. That's the heart of corporate irony. Sometimes the person you tried to erase becomes the one holding the pen. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to squirm. What mattered was what came next. Ben, I said calmly, you have 2 options. You can submit your resignation effective immediately with standard severance, or you can enter a 6-month performance improvement program under my direct supervision. He sat silently for a long moment. I'd like to try the improvement plan, he said, voice low. Then we begin today, I replied, closing my folder. Because real leadership doesn't gloat. It rebuilds, and this rebuilding would start with him. I remember the exact feel of the paper, thick, embossed, cream-colored, the kind of letterhead reserved for promotions, partnerships, and executive appointments. Just 2 weeks earlier, that same kind of folder had been placed in front of me in a sunlit office overlooking San Francisco Bay. It had felt like a beginning. Now the same type of folder sat between me and Ben Callahan, but the weight of it had changed. What had once been an offer of trust was now an ultimatum of accountability. That's the strange symmetry of leadership. You learn to hand out the same tools that once shaped you. Inside this folder, I told him, is your 6-month improvement plan. It includes clear benchmarks, weekly evaluations, and direct mentorship from my team. You'll receive support, but also scrutiny. Ben's fingers hovered just above the flap. He didn't open it, not yet. His pride, once so unshakable, now sat quietly beside him. I didn't enjoy his discomfort, but I didn't shield him from it either. Growth, after all, rarely comes dressed as comfort. We sat in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. I didn't expect this, he admitted. I thought you'd fire me on the spot. I shook my head. We don't build strong systems by breaking people. We build them by offering a chance if they're willing to take it. Ben nodded slowly, then I'll take it. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of turning. A quiet decision to try, perhaps for the first time, to lead from somewhere other than authority. That's the deeper lesson. What looks like punishment to one person can be opportunity to another. It's the same folder, the same paper, but the hands holding it determine its weight. I had once held mine with trembling fingers, unsure if I was enough. Now I was offering one to someone else, not to diminish him, but to ask, who are you willing to become if given the chance? And as we ended the meeting, I realized my job wasn't to replace people like Ben. It was to rewire the culture that made them feel like cutting others was the only way to climb. And that culture, it was about to change store by store. We didn't hang banners or host town halls. There were no grand speeches, no inspirational posters pasted on break room walls. The rebuilding started quietly, one conversation, one correction, one choice at a time. I began by bringing people back, not just bodies, but wisdom. Thomas, who had run warehouse logistics for 22 years, returned without hesitation. I still have my old clipboard, he smiled. Didn't throw it out, just didn't know if it'd be welcome again. It was. Catherine, who had resigned after being placed on an unreasonably harsh improvement plan, agreed to return as our new training lead. But only she said with a raised brow, if I'm allowed to teach people how to lead with empathy. Please do, I told her. We also launched anonymous feedback channels, digital and handwritten, where every employee from stock clerk to shift manager could speak up without fear. Within the first week, I read over 40 notes. Most weren't complaints, they were questions. Why don't we have better safety gloves? Can we rotate shifts to avoid burnout? Will leadership actually read these? Yes, we did. In less than 8 weeks, the numbers began to shift. Turnover dropped 19%, customer satisfaction measured through exit surveys and online reviews climbed 11 points. Shrinkage cut in half. But more telling than the metrics were the faces. People smiled more, laughed more, stayed a little longer after clocking out, helping each other stack crates or finish closing reports. One night, I saw a cashier named Lynn helping a new team member fold uniforms just because she said it's their first week. I remember mine. That's how culture rebuilds itself, not by command, but by quiet invitation. The most touching moment came on a Thursday morning when Marcus from Dairy stopped me near the walk-in freezer. Ms. Whitaker, he said shyly, I just wanted to say, it feels like we're breathing again. I smiled. You never stopped. You were just holding your breath. Because when a workplace becomes toxic, people don't just burn out, they go silent. And bringing back their voices is louder than any press release. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about recovering what we lost. It was about building something stronger than we had before. And as we approached the final stretch of this journey, one last choice had to be made by Ben himself. Ben requested the meeting himself. It was week 6 of his improvement plan. He had made a few efforts, more team meetings, clear handovers, even a quiet apology to Catherine in the hallway. But something in his posture that morning said he'd already made up his mind. He placed an envelope on my desk and sat down, not looking at it. I've been offered a position elsewhere, he said. It's not exactly the same level, but it's less complicated. I nodded. Is this your formal resignation? Yes, he said simply, and thank you for not making this harder than it needed to be. I didn't gloat, didn't press. I just accepted the letter, offered a firm handshake, and said, wishing you success moving forward. He lingered for a second as if expecting more, maybe a parting lesson or final verdict. But I had none to give. Because his chapter in this story was closing, and mine had already turned to the people who stayed. That afternoon, I called Haley into my office. You've been a quiet leader here for a long time, I told her. How would you feel about stepping into the interim general manager role? She blinked. Are you sure I'm ready? I've been sure for months, I said. You lead with clarity, care, and consistency. That's what this store needs now. She accepted with the same calm confidence I once had to fake until it felt real. And just like that, the store began its next phase, not under someone who managed with authority, but someone who led with trust. Within 3 months, all 12 stores in the Northern California region showed improvement, but store 122, that one glowed. Feedback boxes stayed full. Employee satisfaction surveys reached all-time highs. Turnover hit its lowest point in a decade. And one Saturday morning, I found a sticky note left on my office door in handwriting I recognized from the deli section. It read, "Thanks for giving this place back to us." That was when it hit me. Success wasn't walking out as his superior. It wasn't watching Ben squirm or leave. It was watching everyone else stay because they finally had a reason to. Because healing isn't loud. It's steady. It's earned. And it echoes long after the door quietly closes behind the ones who couldn't stay for the right reasons. Now, I stand at my new desk overlooking the bay, the sun warming the windows. My inbox holds numbers, yes, but also names, questions, ideas. The sound of a company breathing again. And me, I'm not done yet. Because the best part of being seen is helping others be seen too.